Relationships are everything.
Welcome to Agency for Change, a podcast from KidGlov that brings you the stories of change makers who are actively working to improve our communities. In every episode, we'll meet with people who are making a lasting impact in the places we call home.
Hey everyone, this is Lyn Wineman, president of KidGlov. Welcome today to a very special episode of the Agency for Change podcast. Today we are doing a crossover episode with Jeremiah Tittle, CEO of Next Chapter Podcasts. He joined me from Hawaii, or I joined him from Nebraska, and we got together and talked about both of our podcasts. So enjoy the conversation.
Welcome to Your Next Chapter, the podcast diving into storytelling's impact on innovation. I'm Jeremiah Tittle, CEO of Next Chapter Podcasts, your host for conversations with creative minds reshaping their worlds through narrative. And this is another crossover episode with the Agency for Change podcast, hosted by Lyn Wineman. Agency for Change brings stories of people creating positive change in the world with a focus on their inspiration and message. Lyn, welcome to Your Next Chapter.
Hey, JT. Great to be in this crossover vortex with you today. I'm excited about this, and I love it because you're in Hawaii and I'm in the Midwest. We are in some kind of time warp vortex here doing this podcast, I think.
It's the multiverse.
It's the multiverse. I love that. I love that. So JT, before we get into today's conversation, I think we need to introduce ourselves. Would you like to start? Tell us a bit about yourself and what you do and the podcast you host.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I fell in love with radio first, interned at my senior year of college at the University of Maryland. For a radio station locally in Washington, D.C., where I'm from. And I just caught the bug. Audio became, everything for me, where I kind of shunned my social life on a Friday night to go into the radio studio and work on my air check and try and impress my program director to become a DJ. Ultimately did become a DJ, but realized how fleeting and how little control I had over my career by focusing on being this on-air talent. And so I was like, I need to both make money as a producer and also kind of learn that skill. And it led me to working at SiriusXM Radio for almost a decade, where I learned how to make podcasts before podcasts were a thing. I was producing a lot of weekly 1 to 2 hour shows.
Wow.
And then after that, made a couple stops, produced a little TV in Miami. And then my old boss from satellite radio was the chief content officer, still is, at TuneIn Internet Radio. So I moved to San Francisco and really saw podcasting's ascent to being, just in the zeitgeist of growing a medium that I no longer thumb my nose at.
Yeah.
And became a believer after we launched a handful of podcasts there. And then I launched my company, Next Chapter, 6 years ago. We did a couple deals with Spotify and iHeart. And now we're creating this really cool Shakespeare series called Play on Podcasts. And then been working with a lot of nonprofits and museums of late. It's been really exciting to also launch this podcast, Your Next Chapter, which is a little bit more of a nerdy inside baseball, but it's about storytelling too, which I think is accessible, more than maybe just podcast for podcast's sake. But it also gives me the opportunity to meet people like you who are doing really cool things in the world, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about Agency for Change and the Agency for Change podcast.
JT, though, I don't know how I should feel about the fact that you have invited me to your nerdy podcast episode. So
it's a compliment now.
Okay, all right.
Being nerd is cool.
I will absolutely take it as that, JT. So I am the founder of KidGlov, and we are a boutique full service advertising agency that has decided to specialize in the area of nonprofits, social impact, and purpose driven business. And as we've done that, we've really fine tuned our own purpose statement to be putting a megaphone in front of those who are doing good in the world. And
Hmm.
so, interestingly, during the early pandemic, KidGlov celebrated our 10th anniversary. And of course, with social distancing and being out of the office, all of our big plans for having the big party and the sparklers and the music and the streamers went out the window. And as we were remotely, complaining about this situation, somebody on the team said, "Why don't we start a podcast?" And so the podcast was our 10th anniversary celebration. And really, there's nothing that better fulfills our purpose of putting a megaphone in front of those who are doing good in the world than the Agency for Change podcast, because we have I just recorded, JT, our 212th episode, which the guest on that episode knew that 212 is the temperature at which water becomes steam. And it was just like this bubbling over of enthusiasm. But we've gotten to interview a lot of really interesting people like yourself who are doing good in the world. And that's what makes me very excited about the Agency for Change.
That's a lot of episodes. We got a long way to go on this podcast for me and I'll never catch up because
you
you're ahead.
We didn't really know where we were going to go with it, JT. When we got started, we said, let's record 3 and just see how it goes, right? We're
I
not going to
love it.
launch until we have 3 in the bag. We recorded 3. The first 3, I can't tell you how nervous I was. I was so nervous. And then probably at about episode 10 or 12, I stopped being so nervous and we started to get some really good feedback from people. And now it's become something that I just love. When I wake up in the morning and see a podcast recording on my schedule, it's like, all right, I'm in for it.
I love that. And I think we're both, I mean, I don't want to, I just kind of met you when we first had our pre-call, but optimism is on the docket here for what executive producer Nick Kastner put in front of me to talk about with you. This should be an easy one, but we are living through a pretty heavy period right now.
Are we? I didn't notice, JT. Really?
I know. That's the go-to joke right now is like, well, for all these news shows trying to keep up with what is happening in our world, it's like,
yeah.
How do you can't keep up with it.
What
It's
is
crazy.
happening? Yeah.
It's insane. We're living through the late 60s. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. 1968 revisited, but what makes you optimistic about the future is the question.
You know what, JT? I am probably, and you and I, we've met, we've talked a couple of times, but I would like to describe myself as an enthusiastic and optimistic person. Like, I have to, in order to get through the day, I have to see the good in situations and the good in people. I have this core belief that most people are trying to do the best thing they know how most of the time. It doesn't always, as a matter of fact, it rarely works out the way they think it will, but I believe people are good at heart. And I am going to work very, very hard to find the positive outcomes of every situation. So even as I think about the pandemic, yes, the pandemic sucked. Like, that's the understatement of the universe, right? But if there hadn't been a pandemic, I wouldn't have started a podcast. If there hadn't been a pandemic, it might not have been so widely accepted for people to record podcasts and meet virtually, so that a girl in Nebraska is talking to a guy in Hawaii about things that sync up. So I'm going to take that as a positive outcome. So I just think that yeah, you have to be realistic.
Mhm.
But I just think it's important to look for the good in people and situations. How about you? You seem like a pretty positive person, and there's a part of me that believes you live in Hawaii, JT. You should be positive.
I should be. I think that should is kind of the double edged sword.
Yeah.
I've told people, staff members, what have you, that they have the right to smack me across the face if I start complaining because I do live in paradise. Um, but I was optimistic long before I moved to Maui during the
Yeah.
pandemic, and I think sometimes that fuels opportunity.
Yeah.
Because if I was always very negative or pessimistic, and I understand there's some benefits to kind of worst case scenario thinking,
Yeah.
but it can get out of control, and it happens to me.
Yeah.
And I think staying optimistic, is something I maybe got from my parents, and it's just you kind of, even if things look really bleak, that if you're like holding on to a sliver of hope, and usually things come back around. The pendulum swings back
Yeah.
and forth. But if I can stay positive, if I can be optimistic, then, you know, whether it's you're going through a tough time, you see like the light at the end of the tunnel. You can kind of get through those tough times, through optimism, through believing that in people, as you
Absolutely.
said. I mean, I think that's beautiful. And I've learned coming to Maui specifically that, to love myself and to take better care of myself, because being in the media industry as long as I have, it's filled with a lot of pessimism and competition. And
I feel
so,
like in today's world, if you're a public figure, and I don't really consider myself a public figure, but if you're a public figure, you are just opening yourself up. Like people just feel like they can say whatever they want. They don't like your eyebrows, they don't like your voice. That was my number one fear of starting a podcast, is that people were going to comment that they hated my voice, because I kind of have an unusual voice. I'm not much of a singer or anything, but I think it's really interesting how people feel like they can shoot arrows at you. And if you don't have that self acceptance and that self love, then you don't have much of a shield against those arrows. And I also think it's hard to think well of other people if you don't think well of yourself. So I do
mm,
think optimism, success, like a lot of the good in life starts with what's inside of you. And I think any kind of self work you can do, not being self absorbed, but really that self work, I think that's so important. And it just permeates everything around you.
I totally agree, and I really believe in giving people a chance,
Yes,
and just kind of being open minded. I mean, I there's a lot of ways that I am closed minded, but I feel like if I can just take a step back, give it a beat, and think about, okay, we're all human, we're all going to
yeah,
make mistakes,
yes,
but it doesn't mean that we can't see the other side, or try and walk in other people's shoes and have some empathy,
absolutely.
um, for what people are going through at their point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what role do you think business plays in shaping a positive future?
Oh, I think it plays a huge role. And this is something I actually have done a lot of study on in the last couple of years. But since the pandemic, people are looking for purpose and belonging in their lives, right? And there's a
Yeah.
lot of research that says a lot of your sense of purpose comes from your work. And more people, particularly in younger generations, are intentionally choosing to work with companies or work at companies that have some type of a positive impact, or at least have core values that fit their own. I think the workforce has become that much more choosy. And then I also think beyond creating a great culture for your team members, I think every business that has a voice has a chance to use that voice for good. And I think people are tending to be attracted to or finding more impactful the more positive messaging as well. Particularly in the space that we work in with nonprofits, there's a great body of research that speaks to the fact that when you're working on fundraising, people want to give to winners. They want to give to nonprofits that have an impact. And the
Yeah,
impact is the positive part of your story. So, most human service organizations are solving some of the deepest and darkest things imaginable. But yet, when you're communicating in the public, yes, you have to create awareness of that's the problem that you're solving, but you don't want to go so deep on the negative aspect of it. You want to go deep on the positive outcome of that situation. And I think that's a really important part of using a voice for good. And I think that applies to for profits as well as nonprofits too.
I agree. I went to business school and I dropped out. But
Oh, well,
while there,
business school is boring. I'm sorry for my friends that went to business school, but I can understand.
I actually loved it, but I
Okay.
had this job opportunity. I'd never worked in TV, so I ended up moving to Miami to produce TV, and I was like, well, so what is the point of business school? It's to either find a great job or give you all the tools to be able to run a business. And I found a great job that I couldn't pass up because it was a dream of mine. But the reason I bring it up is because while at business school, we looked at all sorts of different companies, case studies, Harvard Business Review, and you're looking at various different companies and how their culture, as you brought up, kind of optimism and also having a positive impact. And I just remember how important it was to successful businesses that are having a positive impact. I interned at Discovery Channel while there, and I
Cool.
was in the education department. It was really cool in Silver Spring, Maryland, where the headquarters used to be. And the I remember I was scanning through the CSR budgets of big for-profit organizations, corporate social responsibility,
Yeah,
just and um, and all sorts of giant companies have huge budgets devoted to positive impact. I love nonprofits because their mission is pretty clear and typically focused on the specific issue that they're solving for and trying to have a positive impact on. But yeah, just to echo what you said on the for profit, like giant corporations, I think are seeing more and more, and I
absolutely.
think maybe the youth is driving this more than anyone, right?
Yeah. I love the boldness of Gen Z really going out there, right? And kind of almost demanding, like when I graduated from college and went into the work world, I went in with this attitude of, I have got to pay my dues. I have to start at the bottom. I have to work my way to the top. And I love the boldness of the younger generation coming in and not having that attitude, having a different attitude. So, JT, I'm also going to backpedal a little bit for all my friends who run business schools and businesses. I don't really think business school is boring. I actually have a minor in economics, which
Okay.
most people don't find appealing. I loved economics and I love the whole entrepreneurship curriculum that most colleges are introducing right now. So, JT,
I'm
I have a question for you because I know you are a storyteller and you've been a storyteller throughout your career. How do you see storytelling driving innovation in today's business world?
Yeah, well, one thing I think is really important, and we talk a lot about storytelling on your next chapter. One thing that's really important, I think, in particular for nonprofits, and those trying to have an impact is, what's your elevator pitch?
Yeah.
I know it's not like these days people have less and less of an attention span.
Yep.
So can you tell a story in a short period of time that resonates with people? People get it, what you do, what your mission is. And then there's podcasting where
Yeah.
you have more time to be able to go deeper. I always make the relation between podcasting and TV, where you might have like 2 minutes on your local TV network to really share, the impact that you're having or seeking to have in the world. But in a podcast, you and I can sit here and have a great conversation for 30,
Absolutely.
40 minutes and really go deep and add the nuance to it all. And that storytelling, the story doesn't have to end in that short period of time. We can go deeper. So that's why I love podcasting and storytelling, just for any organization, any executive trying to share the vision of what they're trying to do with their organization. A story is the best and kind of only way to get your message across.
Absolutely. It's interesting, JT. I was talking last week to a nonprofit executive who had decided that in order to get their message out, they needed to go on the national speaker circuit, and they really didn't want to. It's not a person that loves standing up in front of crowds, but they just had convinced themselves that that was the only way. And they were talking about creating their presentation and getting an agent to book them into gigs and all the things. And you could just see in this conversation that this executive did not have the enthusiasm for doing that. And I said, have you thought about podcasting instead of going out on that national stage and waiting 6 months until you give your one presentation and doing all the things? What if you find a handful of podcasts that reach your audience and go pitch yourself and do some podcasts? Because the great thing about podcasting is it's a bit more comfortable setting. I mean, you're oftentimes at your desk or in a podcast studio. You can have some notes with you, a little secret that everybody probably knows. If there's a blooper, you can fix it.
Right.
I think podcasting is just a great medium. And you're right. Very few executives have a forum where they can tell a 15, 20, 30-minute story and really go deep on who they are and what they do and why it matters and what kind of impact they're having. And I love a podcast just for that purpose.
Another thing about storytelling that, well, the good thing, just to echo what you said, like, it's kind of on your terms, which is
Right.
nice.
Yeah.
So that's a beautiful thing, whether you're in your closet,
I recorded one podcast in my closet,
Did you?
JT, just one. During the pandemic on a snowy day, we did it in the closet. All of my clothes and shoes around me. Yep. The sound quality was very good, though.
Yeah, exactly. I always encourage our talent to go in the closet and record. Make sure there's a lot of fluffy clothing around that you don't need to pay for all the soundproofing and all that. But on the storytelling front, I just wanted to note, because this is on my LinkedIn, but as I said, I believe in the power of the spoken word. And then I quoted this author, Jonathan Gutschall, who talks about evolutionary storytelling. This was on Star Talk. I used to be a big Star Talk junkie.
I love it. Yeah.
So great. But this is the quote. He says, we've evolved to delight in stories actually because they are so utilitarian. Stories were humanity's first great technology for storing vital cultural information, freezing it in the ember of the story, and make it transmissible over the course of generations. So what was it? It was around the campfire. It was cave drawings and, the story of when we escaped the lion or whatever it was, centuries ago, where these stories have evolved over time. But it's kind of the way to keep our culture on record in a way.
Absolutely.
Whether it's the culture of our organization, if I'm running a nonprofit, or if it's just a family legends, those types of things that can be passed along.
I think you're right. I think that sometimes when we're trying to use logic, we just think, hey, I'm just going to put those bullet points out there. I'm just going to put out the bullet points and be done with it. But people don't remember bullet points. They might scan them and pick out the things that they want. People remember stories, and it's particularly stories that touch their hearts in a certain way, or stories that they can relate to and go, oh, goodness, I had something similar happen to me. Storytelling is amazing. When we think about storytelling, JT, we think about it even from the very beginning. We like to start thinking about storytelling with the brand. And when I talk about branding, I think about a pyramid, and I think about the name of the organization at the top, and then their logo, and then their tagline, and then their elevator statement, and then their visual identity, and then the verbiage that they use to describe themselves. And even at the top of that pyramid, the name of your organization starts to tell that story. And anymore, the name, like our name, KidGlov, the name doesn't have to tell the whole story itself, but it's an invitation to curiosity to say, wait a minute, what's that all about? And the tagline doesn't have to tell the whole story. And even the elevator statement doesn't have to tell the whole story. But each of those things have to work in unison to keep you wanting more, which has to be something you learned in radio and show business too, right? Like always keep them wanting more. Like each of those elements is just starting to tell the story and pique the interest of the audience.
I think that's exactly what you achieve with Kid Club, because I'm curious. It makes me like, I want to know more. Exactly. So,
Yeah.
well,
Well,
you're so
can
right.
I tell you? Can I tell you the KidGlov story?
Please, I would love to. Yes.
So KidGlov is based on that statement, to treat someone with kid gloves, because at the core of our being, we treat brands and we treat people with great care. And I
Mm,
like to say that a lot of advertising agencies are boxing gloves. They have the tendency to come up with a
mm.
great idea and pummel you into submission, right? Kid Glove, we're going to collaborate. We're going to button up great strategies, and we're going to work with you in a very positive and optimistic environment, bringing this full circle to where we started.
You brought up advertising. I was curious how you see the advertising industry evolving maybe over the next 5 to 10 years. I mean,
Oh,
everything you just shared is like, I think we're going in a certain direction, but you definitely.
yeah. I think the advertising industry is going to evolve over the next 5 to 10 minutes, right? Like it is constantly changing because consumer behavior is constantly changing, and the way people tend to receive information and engage with brands is constantly changing. So I think, the constant is going to be technology. Technology gives us so many more opportunities to reach a more narrow audience more deeply, a broader audience more specifically, gives us so many different ways to communicate. Now, with AI, we have tools that help us communicate and maybe help us do some of the things that are the more tedious part of the business. But I think the industry is going to continue to change because the technology is going to give us more opportunities. But we also have to continually keep an eye on where the consumer is. How do they want to receive and consume information? Because honestly, the way it's happening today is not the same as it was 2 or 3 years ago. And that shift is happening ever so much more quickly. What are you seeing on your end? Because you're in this storytelling business too. How do you see things changing, JT?
I mean, we alluded to the attention spans
Yeah.
earlier, so they're getting shorter.
Can you believe it? When I first got in this business, somebody said to me, you never want to make a video longer than 20 minutes. If you put a 20-minute video in front of me, I might just climb the walls, right? But yet I'll listen to a 20-minute podcast while I'm commuting or while I'm maybe doing yard work or something else, right? So it's just interesting. And today, I mean, today, a 90-second video just feels like an eternity.
Oh, it's so true. Oh my goodness. Unless that content is primo,
Yes.
glued to your phone content. But yeah, I mean, I think a big wake up call for me, I'm not a big TikTok user myself, but when it was reported that TikTok had become the number one search engine in the
Yes.
US with 2 out of 5 Americans
You're like,
using
I
it,
better take this thing seriously, right?
100%.
Yeah.
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 Like we need to invest in this, and TikToks are short.
Right.
They're,
They're very
you
short.
know,
Yeah.
they may not be the full, shebang, but they are the gateway drug or what have you. They're, to get you into, say, a podcast, say this
Absolutely.
episode, for example, we can post a short little promo clip and say, listen to the whole thing here. Here's a link. Um, and, I just think that that's emblematic of what we're saying as far as like where it's going. Yes, the youth are using TikTok more, I'm sure, than someone's grandparents. But it is absolutely revolutionizing how we're consuming.
Yes.
And I love the fact that I think podcasts are kind of a response to that the inundation of stimuli that we
Yeah.
have.
Yeah.
If you turn on TV and you see 9 talking heads and you see the crawl at the bottom, scrolling through news, and then there's the time and different times, like news is crazy to even
Yeah.
consume for 2 seconds these days. And a lot of the content that I am consuming is all through my phone.
Absolutely, all through your phone. So, with all the things that are changing, JT, there is one thing that I think will always be a constant in advertising, and that is understanding your strategy, right? So, I think the downside of all of the opportunity with technology is it is so easy to get distracted by the shiny objects that you
Mhm.
forget what are we trying to accomplish here. Even with KidGlov's podcast, there are times when it's like, oh, I'd like to go after this speaker or that speaker or do these things, and then I'm like going back to, no, our show is about telling the story of people who are making positive change and really staying true to that. And that's why, to me, this crossover episode is perfect, because you, with this podcast, are in a similar space to us in speaking to positive change and change makers and making the world a better place. But I think always understanding who you are, why anyone should care what you're doing, and then sticking to your strategy, I think, is really important. So if TikTok helps you deliver on your strategy, you should be there. And if it doesn't, you should be somewhere else, because you see it all the time. Marketers who stretch themselves too thin, and then they can't do anything well because they don't have enough saturation in any particular strategy or tactic.
It's so true. And it really reminds me of we just went through a rebrand, new website and all that. This process was out of necessity because we were on this old version of Squarespace that was not optimized for
Oh,
mobile. It
yeah.
was really just antiquated. So we're like, okay, we need to make a change. Our web developer was telling us for like a year.
Yeah.
And we're like, okay, we're going to move forward with this thing. But what the great byproduct of going through that process was to look at our DNA. Who are we? What are we
Right.
trying to do here?
Yes.
It was. I love the last thing you just said. Actually, is perfect because when we looked at ourselves, we learned a lot that we had not been
Yeah.
looking in the mirror. We had, kind of our slogan, elevating bold, authentic voices. We definitely had a mission to try and, make the world a better place, to educate people. And then, just going through this process, we started here, which was, oh wow, this is who we are today. We kind of moved over here. We tried out, toyed with a couple different things, and we ended up going kind of right back to the center.
Hey, that's good though, because that means you were in the right place, but you tested it, right? You didn't just, and maybe you tested it by, just seeing what felt right to you. But it's an important process to go through at least once a decade, I would say, for every company. You shouldn't be changing your name or your logo every decade, but you should be really reevaluating your core messaging, which is expressed as your tagline, your elevator statement, your foundational message. How do you answer that question about who you are in a way that gets people wanting more?
Yeah, and the person, brand strategist, who had worked with before, who led this with us, did such a great job, and actually was encouraging us to double down on kind of our positive impact, social justice, et cetera, that we wanted to invest more in, as opposed to going more milk toast. Like,
Yeah,
that's why we say with podcasters too, new podcasters, businesses looking to get into this space, is like, how are you different? What's your niche?
absolutely.
Like, because niche is going to trump this generalist approach, I think, 9 times out of 10.
I agree with you. I mean, I think it's better to have a differentiated strategy and describe how you're different than it is to say we're the best. Because when you're saying we're
Totally.
the best, or I'm going to tell you my two pet peeves are the words world class and premier, because they literally mean nothing to it. They're just you bragging, right? And so I'm
Totally.
sorry if this podcast describes itself that way. I didn't see that anywhere though, JT, but
World's best premier podcast is our tagline. So thanks for insulting me.
but I think that being able to differentiate is really really important. And sometimes it's scary for business leaders to go, "Oh, I don't want to close the doors," right? Like I want the opportunity to serve anybody. But the reality is you're going to win more business. You're going to serve that business more efficiently, more productively, if you have a point of view and a voice. I think that's really important.
Absolutely. And I want to go back to not be the poster child for TikTok, because I actually don't even use it that much. I do think it is important for business, but I was going to say I'm spending a lot more time on LinkedIn than I ever
Okay.
have. I used to have this idea that it was this place for people to only look for jobs, or whenever you're kind of out of work and open to work or whatever. But I think it's really changed. I think LinkedIn is become, yes, it's kind of a braggy platform. I mean, I guess Instagram and all these other social media platforms share that, but yeah, I think like that's one thing we've been talking to, whether it's prospective clients or existing clients. Some, they're like, we only care about LinkedIn.
Yeah.
That's where we are doing our business. We're catching clients there. We're building, our story and kind of having that on display. And I think I love how that's kind of evolved, that it's no longer just like a looking for work location.
I'm going to confirm my nerd status by saying that I love LinkedIn, right?
Okay.
But I do have to say I get many, many, many thoughtless sales solicitations on LinkedIn, and
Fair.
I feel like I'm blocking those every day. But I do have some good connections. And once again, I think this kind of leans into our remote world that allows a girl from the Midwest and a guy from Hawaii to have a connection, right? Like, I think that we'll get to know each other on this podcast. We'll probably connect on LinkedIn. And over the years, I'll be like, oh, JT's up to this. And someday I'm going to say, hey, JT, I saw you're doing this and I'm doing this. Could we connect on this in some way that helps each other? And I think that's what I like about LinkedIn is you can build, you can curate a community, I think, of like-minded individuals that that can stay connected regardless of where they are geographically. So I do like that. Being an optimistic person, though, I do definitely curate my network to get rid of the negative
Good
voices
for
as
you.
well. I very
Yeah.
carefully do that. Yeah.
Well, the algorithms, no matter what social media platform, don't always get it right.
True.
And like, I follow thousands of people on Instagram, and I'll see kind of the same people over and over again. I'm
Yeah,
like,
that's
show me
true.
some more. What's going on? But that's, I would say, if I were to differentiate, and this is probably not a fair comparison, but Facebook and Instagram, like I try to spend the least amount of time possible on Facebook because I have just friends from high school who are espousing the craziest of ideas.
Yes, yes, yes.
Whereas even if we could say LinkedIn is a place where there is a lot of humble brags, at least, like you said, we understand what people are up to, what they're building, and there's a lot less, if
Yeah.
any at all, for me in that kind of political
Yeah.
space that I don't really want to consume,
I know.
which is nice. I don't mind people get a new job. I hear about it and or
Yeah, it's kind of nice to know where they are, right? Like, oh, that's cool to watch your career progress and see where you're going and what you're doing. Yeah, I think that's kind of cool.
yeah, and it is a good place for with we partnered with sales advertising network for a handful of our podcasts, and so I get to see the other things that this network is doing and getting involved in. So that's really cool. And you've already shared kind of how you got into the business of podcasts, but I was curious, going back to the podcast conversation, how do you see it disrupting sort of marketing and communications? What do you see the value of podcasting now?
I think it's a whole new channel that I kind of put under the umbrella of public relations or earned
Sure.
media.
Yeah.
I think now either starting a podcast or pitching yourself or your story onto podcasts has become a whole channel that we didn't have access to a few years ago. I think, one of the days I was most excited about the Agency for Change podcast was a couple years ago. The first time we had somebody pitch themselves to be on our podcast, because before that it was all us, like going, oh, well, let's ask this person and that person. And for the most part, we ask people and they say yes, and it all works out. But
Mhm.
when we started to have people pitch themselves to us, it was like, oh, hey, somebody noticed that we're doing this. So that was pretty exciting. And now whole, podcast agencies and businesses like yourself have popped up, and it's created a whole new kind of sub industry within communications, marketing, and storytelling. So that's what I see. And then one thing I love about a podcast too is you can use it in the long form, but you can also slice and dice the key messages and use that content in other ways. As a matter of fact, JT, that leads me to one of the favorite things we do on the Agency for Change podcast that, if you'll permit me, I'd love to do now
Please go for it.
on every single episode, because I get to talk with such inspiring people. I've asked them for their own words of wisdom to inspire our audience. So, since this will be on the Agency for Change lineup, can you give me JT's original quote?
My original quote is relationships are everything.
Oh, yeah.
The subtext is, and this is I learned this from my mentor. The subtext is don't burn bridges. There are times as I am getting older and maturing. uh, I, I'm not
You?
mature. I'm not mature yet. Well timed. That was really well played. But you just never know
Right.
when a connection that you make will come back into your life. The best example I have is um, John Russick. I'll name him. Was the head of the Chicago History Museum. We pitched them hard over many meetings, all these proposals, decks, etc., and he wanted it to happen, but he was kind of on his way out from the Chicago History Museum. Ended up as the interim CEO at the Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, North Carolina, also a history museum with a kind of a social justice angle. And when he was there, he recommended in his interim role that they start a podcast and that they work with me, with us at Next
Yeah,
Chapter.
because you started that you planted the seed. You don't really know when, if you never plant the seed, it will never come to fruition. But there's a lot of seeds that we plant that you don't know. 1 year, 5 years. I had one client that I worked for several years who said, Lyn, stop calling me. I have an agency that I'm happy with. And then one day out of the blue, she called me and said, okay, I'm ready for you. Come over. Let's have lunch and talk about transitioning our account. And I was just like, wow, okay. But seed was planted at some point, right?
Yeah, and you could say this is sales, but I never really wanted to think of myself as a
Yeah.
salesperson. I've grown in that department and I want to keep growing in that area, but it's about relationships when it comes down to it. And it's not always with people that can help you that you need to
Right.
invest in those relationships. I think I lived in LA for 3 years and there's a lot of that where it's like, how can you help me? Okay, you can't. See you later.
I'm out.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I am generalizing about an entire metropolis, so forgive me. But I will say, just like the investment in relationships, whether they are people of power or not at all, no resources at all, you just never know where it's going to go and how
Yeah.
later, because you were good in keeping up with that person, you said you followed up, and you think you might be annoying, but I mean, I think being persistent
Yeah.
is not a bad thing, and investing in relationships with your time, you just never know when and where and how all that stuff can come together later.
I think too, one thing I love about your quote, relationships are everything. I also think you don't know what's going on in someone's life, right? As a matter of fact, one of my favorite books that I read in the last year is called Anxious People, which
Hmm.
sounds like a self help book, but it's actually a comedic story about this crazy group of people that are brought together by a bank robbery and how they each on the surface seem very stereotypical, and then you learn about their lives and it's like, whoa, that is not what I expected. But when you come at life from a relationship standpoint, you might be that one person during the day in somebody's life that, because you took a minute to listen or respond positively, you maybe made a difference that you will never, ever, ever, ever realize. And I think that's a pretty cool thing.
Hmm. No, that's a mic drop moment out of you right there, Lynn. That was that was strong. Um, no, because it's also, like I said, it's not just about people who can help you or wherever they are in life, but it's also about how can you help others, you know?
Absolutely.
And to your point, you don't know if someone's going through depression,
Yep.
whatever their personal situation is. We don't know what's
Yep.
going on in people's lives. If someone snaps at you at Starbucks or whatever it is,
Yeah.
like you don't know what they're going through. Don't take it personally.
Yeah.
Um, and anything you can do to help and kind of see if someone's hurting and kind of lend a helping hand, a kind word, that could go a long way and more than you may know.
Yeah, absolutely, JT. So I love that quote. And what we do with the quotes is we just keep a running tally of all the quotes. So on our website, we just celebrated our 200th Agency for Change episode, and we put a blog with all of these quotes, and it's so
Oh,
fun to run back through them. And a few people slid in with quotes from their favorite authors and so forth, and that's okay. But I just think also that most people don't realize the greatness within them. And so, one
mhm.
reason I like to ask you for your quote is because I see the greatness and the inspiration in you. And I want to bring that out by having an original quote from you. So, can I ask you one more question that
Please go for it.
probably in the last year, we started wrapping up all of our podcasts with this question. And it ties back to branding, JT, because in branding, what we're trying to do is get to what is the one most important thing you want people to remember about you. And so for each podcast episode, I like to ask, and I'm asking you now, what is the most important thing you would like people to remember about the work that you're doing?
I think the most important thing would be that nothing is static.
Mm,
Everything is in motion. Everything's evolving, and that means that there's an opportunity to impact people and affect systems, situations that feel like they're just in this gridlock. Um, I could list just a handful of issues that the globe is facing right now.
yeah.
Um, and I think we have to believe that we can change
Yeah.
the world.
Yeah.
We have to believe it, because otherwise, nothing will change, or it'll change in the direction that we don't want it to go, because people will take advantage of their power and what have you. But I think believing that you can change and organizing and community, that's something that we really seek to do. It may be more subversive if we're making a scripted podcast with a history museum. It may be direct at times, but I think like we have to maintain the belief that the work that we're doing and trying to educate people and inspire people, that they can make the world a better place, through reflecting on history and then saying, hey, it doesn't have to be this way. We can evolve. We can be better. We can help people and be a positive light in the world.
What I love about that too is it says, I'm in advertising, you're in podcasting and entertainment. There are some people who would maybe dismiss those professions, but what you're doing is making a difference in the world. It makes me think of, I used to have an Arthur Ashe quote on my laptop, and I
Mm,
might mangle this a little bit, but it was something like start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And what that means to me, and the reason I think it relates back to what you just said, is that you don't have to change everything all at once. You don't
mm,
have to do it all by yourself, but also don't wait. Don't wait until it's perfect. Like, get started, move forward, do the next thing, do the next thing, do the next thing. And that to me gives me great optimism that we have the power to do the next thing.
100%. I love that. I think that's wonderful. We end our show with a question that I'll pose to you now.
Okay.
Um, so the name of the podcast is Your Next Chapter, that I host, and the question for you is, what is your next chapter? What's next for you?
Oh my goodness. I'm so glad that you asked. I have had a lifelong goal of writing a book, and literally my next chapter is writing that book. And part of the reason I love connecting on LinkedIn with authors and interviewing authors on the podcast is I'm just seeking to learn everything I can from them. But my book, and actually it's our book at KidGlov, I mean, you won't be surprised. It's about branding, but we're going to give away our secret sauce in the book for creating a brand. And we're writing a fable to go along with it, because you, having gone through this experience yourself, know that it can be an arduous, sometimes nerve-wracking, sometimes overwhelming process. Sometimes it could be a very expensive process, but it doesn't have to be. And so what we're doing is taking you through the process with some storytelling. So the first 3 chapters of 12 are drafted, and it's all outlined, and the characters are mapped. So I'm just really excited about it.
Oh, that's so exciting! I can't wait to read it, and I love that you have a fable in there, because Aesop's fables we grew up with, and I still remember those like it was
right.
yesterday.
Yes.
So doesn't that prove the importance of storytelling? You know?
It would seem slightly ridiculous to be advocating for storytelling and then giving you a dry book full of bullet points, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
There will be some bullet points, but the bullet points will come after the story. It'll be, this is the story. Now this is what you do. This is the story. This is what you do. So that's the plan. I have been talking about this forever, and finally earlier this year, it's like, you know what? It's time to get started. So
time to get started.
It's moving.
This is really cool.
Yeah. So thank you for asking.
Absolutely. I know you're a devout enemy of all bullet points.
Yes.
But
I am a world class enemy
yes.
of bullet points. Yes.
You're the premier bullet point hater.
Yes, that is my title.
Lyn, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me and having me on your show simultaneously.
Absolutely. This podcast crossover metaverse has been really fun. Thank you, JT. I can't wait to continue listening to your show, because you are doing some really good work.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Next Chapter. Leave us a 5-star review if you would. Hosted by myself, JT. Executive produced by Nick Kastner. Edited by Justin Cortese. And we drop an episode every other week, so follow the feed to stay tuned for future episodes. And thank you so much, Lyn.
Thank you, JT. This has been a lot of fun.